We have reached the part of the show where Alyssa and I are joined by two of our favorite people, probably two of your favorite people. Let me bring those two people on. First, she is a writer, producer, and actor. It's Grace Parra. Grace.
Guys, hi.
Next, she is a writer and a comedian, and she's the head writer, once again, of the CBS Diversity Showcase. Hello, Tien Tran.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
We're so glad you're here today. So I just want to just to let our listeners know, we decide what's going to be in the show starting around Sunday, Monday before we record. And this week, because of what had been going on in the UK and Australia, we had a pretty good idea of what we wanted this conversation to be. We're recording on Wednesday. On Tuesday, there was a tragedy in Atlanta. A man shot 8 people at Asian spas, 3 different Asian spas. 6 of those people were women. And so that has sort of changed the way that the conversation is going to go. So I want to start by quoting a law enforcement official from Atlanta. I don't want to name the guy because, who the fuck cares who he is? I don't want to name him. He doesn't deserve a name. But I do want to talk about the way that he's being treated by law enforcement and the press. So, there was a press conference with law enforcement. And Alyssa, you watched it, right?
Yep.
What did you think of it?
Look, I'm never quite sure how helpful those press conferences are because they come at a demand for information when people actually don't have all the information. So I don't really think that they ever serve the purpose they are intended to. But, I think that my takeaway, which I think is where you're going, is that there was a lot of excusing or apologizing for what this monster had done, trying to explain. It was interesting because they tried to explain what they think was going on. Essentially, they were like, he's a sex addict and he was blaming these parlors for giving him sort of this outlet to do something he knows that he shouldn't be doing. So they say they don't know the motive. They don't think it's a hate crime. He's a sex addict. So it's either say you don't know or say it when you know. Because
Exactly.
I just found it utterly unhelpful and frankly kind of silly.
Yeah. One of the quote that stuck out for me, because I didn't watch the whole thing like you did, Alyssa. You have way more intestinal fortitude than I do.
That's a compliment.
Yeah, it in the best possible way, and also the worst because it means you're watching these press conferences. But there was a quote that really stuck out to me, and Tien, I really want to hear your thoughts on this. The quote that stuck out to me was a law enforcement official said, "Yesterday was a really bad day for him, and this is what he did." This is a man describing the actions of a man who killed 8 people. Tien, I know that this is a hard story for you, and I just would love to hear you share what's going through your mind and how you feel about that quote.
What an insane fucking thing to say. I am feeling a lot of feelings, and most of them are sadness and fear. I feel upset that I feel scared now, in a way that I didn't before. I feel like walking around in the Midwest by myself and walking past white men when I'm by myself. I'm there now. I have this tinge of what are they going to say? Because I already had it happen here. Some fucking bro-y college student told me to fuck off. And
Why? You're the least fuck offable person I know.
Seriously.
Because he tried to give me a high five and I didn't give him one, and he told me to fuck off, bitch, which felt very both sexist, but also he didn't do it to any of the he just did it to me, and I was on the street by myself. Anyway, I think my overall fear is that hearing that and hearing the fact that they're we can't say it's a hate crime. We can't say it's gendered violence. Yeah, that guy isn't going to fucking show up in the police interrogation and say those things? Can we please connect the dots and call it what it is? It is a hate crime, and it is gendered violence specifically. It is violence against women. And I saw something that was shared that I think is very pertinent to this, is that something that is not talked about enough with regards to racial violence against Asians is the type of sexual violence that Asian women face, how interconnected that is to violence against those in the sex trade, and how that violence has been so deeply shaped by American imperial wars in Asia. Like, this isn't a new thing, the way that Asian women are sexualized, and violence against Asian women and violence against women is because we have this, we allow and are normalizing these patriarchal or like boys will be boys narrative, which is why that guy can say that's the worst day. Like, I had a bad day. He was able to center himself because he's like, oh, God damn it. I can center myself and say, like, I had a bad day today because I got to go deal with a boy who is being bad.
I got a speeding ticket. I guess I'm going to commit some hate crimes today.
Yeah.
It's a bad day.
It's a bad day.
Well, and also, not for nothing, they treat these villains, these criminals, these murderers like children. Does anybody think this fucking guy doesn't know the penalty is 100 times stiffer if it is categorized as a hate crime? So, like, why? That's why I think that these press conferences are so fucking stupid, because, like, don't give him the benefit of the doubt. So now you have every anchor on every cable news channel being like, he said it wasn't a hate crime. No, like, are you fucking kidding me? Give me a break.
Yeah.
Right, because people are tainted by the first information they receive about things.
Exactly.
And that's sort of like the problem with breaking news reporting is that, yeah, I think it would be really irresponsible for police to come out and say definitively, yes, this 100%, we know, we have evidence that this is what happened. But it's also irresponsible of the news media to report it without like a pile of grains of salt. Like, just to preface, this is an ongoing investigation. This is what we for sure know. This is what we don't know. Here's some wild shit the cops say based on nothing. You know? And that's what it feels like to me. I want to tie this into kind of the larger point here, because the excuse making is something we see that in a lot of cases accompanies these moments that are like watershed moments where people come together and are like, what the fuck? Something needs to change. It's time for something to change. There's always on the other side of that somebody saying, well, actually, you know, the person who is doing these things, the person that did this isn't so bad. We're humanizing the person who is the perpetrator and we're villainizing the victims. So in Australia this week, thousands of people, mostly women, participated in marches, and that's because there have been multiple sexual assault allegations involving current members of parliament. There is a woman who says she was raped in a minister's office in 2019. Another person, the Attorney General, Christian Porter, was investigated for rape in 1988. Women are pretty mad about it. And the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, so far will not meet with organizers or protesters, which, look, I know some nice Scots, but that's a typical Scot move, right? Right? It's just like, yeah. Yeah, Scott, of course you won't meet with them. Come on, dude. Over the past weekend, there were protests in the UK against the abduction and murder of 33-year-old Sarah Everard. Everard was walking home alone at night in London on March 3rd. On March 9th, a Metropolitan Police officer was arrested for the crime. On the 10th, her remains were found. There was a vigil in Clapham Common that grew into a large demonstration, and police responded in a very coppy way, I'm going to say, when they tackled and arrested several of the women who were armed with candles and signs. So those two protests have gotten a little bit less attention than huge protests that went on in Mexico on International Women's Day. I'm not sure if people read about this, but if you didn't, what is going on in Mexico when it comes to women and girls is major and important. A large crowd carrying their children, blowtorches, bats, and hammers protested outside of the National Palace in Mexico City. The protests were sparked because Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador supports Felix Salgado Macedonio, who is a candidate for governor in the state of Guerrero, who has been accused of rape by several women. In addition, Mexico has a super high rate of violence against women. An average of 10 women were killed in Mexico every day last year. There were 16,000 cases of rape. One investigation found that only 5% of sexual assault allegations, including rape, result in a criminal sentence in Mexico. In Turkey, on International Women's Day, 13 women were arrested and detained for insulting the president. Insulting the president. Thousands have marched in India against sexual violence. In the U.S., last February, thousands of women protested violence suffered by Native and Indigenous women. In the U.S. and Canada, Native and Indigenous women suffer violence at a much higher rate than other groups. And last year on International Women's Day, 1 million Chilean women took to the streets in Santiago to protest violence against women. And the next day, they just didn't show up for work to show what it would look like without them. So I'm not trying to equivocate between all of these movements, but what I am trying to do is kind of draw a thread between all of them. Like in every part of the world, women do not feel as safe as men. And there is a reason for that. And the protests are happening in an attempt to change those reasons. Grace, I want to toss to you, because every time women gather en masse to protest against violence against women, which is overwhelmingly done to us by men, there are men who unhelpfully jump in and claim not all men. What do you make of the not all men guys?
It's interesting, especially in the context of Mexico, because one of the complaints that President López Obrador himself has issued and sort of counter to these protests is, look at all the women that I employ. Look at all the women in my administration. There are more women in my administration than in any administration. So Mexico's fine. We as a country are totally fine because look at how many women are employed by my administration. And I think that we're seeing that everywhere. I think actually that's something that Governor Cuomo's office has argued as well. Or, look at how many women that I have in my office. So obviously
Brett Kavanaugh's done it too.
Exactly. So there's this false equivocation that if women are present, if women are employed, then violence against women doesn't exist. But the fact of the matter is that those two things are very, very, very separate. I'll also point, because I'm so glad that we're talking about Mexico today, there's an interesting element to public transportation in Mexico, which is that there are actually women-only subway cars on subways because of the amount of violence, which I find is striking because God, for so long, suffragettes in this country and feminists across the world have fought for equality so that we can occupy the same public spaces as men. But now we have moved so far in the direction of such vicious and tangible violence against women in public spaces that now countries are forced to make spaces just for women in public areas and in public transportation spots. And I find that to be really sad that though I'm thrilled that there is at least an awareness of the kind of violence that's happening, and that there are moves to make women feel more safe, that there is also just this acceptance that violence is everywhere, and so rather than fix the problem, let's just put a Band-Aid on it by making sure that we're providing women-only spaces, so it looks like we're doing something. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but it was. Yeah. I've just been thinking a lot about this in particular with Mexico, as I see how they've really mangled the response to these protests, and it is at once heartening that there are so many women that are willing to take to the streets, and men too. Not to disregard their involvement.
Not no men.
Not no men.
That's right. The other side of not all men. Not no men.
Not no men. But the one thing that I'll also say too is I do believe that a thread that we're seeing in many of these protests across the world is the language is a little less pretty, in a way that I find really useful. But it's not like we have to support women or like let's look out for women. We need to stop rape. We need to stop misogyny. We need to stop assault against women. We have to stop femicide. I'm seeing a more, and I think it's because there's more anger in women across the world, that we are, we have to be specific and we have to use language that is raw and that is real. in order to get the point across, because, you know, support all women and let's be there for each other and like give your ladies a hug or whatever bullshit. It's too soft. It's too pretty. And that's, I think, a common thread that I've seen throughout a lot of these protests.
That language of like, we support women, and that sort of softness also completely erases who is doing a lot of the violence. Like, so many of these things, it's like the stats of like 1 in so many women have experienced sexual assault. Okay, well, like, who's doing it? It's like, okay, so all of this violence is happening, but we don't have a perpetrator, and we're not going to name him, and we're not going to name the men that are the violence that is like being put on women is mostly at the hands of men, and like we don't name it, and like I think it's very much a systemic thing, like you said, Grace, of like having these women only sections on the bus. Like, it's sad because I think that is, you know, governments and people in power, politicians being like, you know what, we do see it's a problem, but again, it is on you, women, to take care of yourselves, get on the right train, don't walk home at night, be with friends, you know, all of these things. Like, we have just normalized for all of our friends and family, women, trans folks, non-binary folks, like, to be afraid moving in public space. And we have normalized it.
Yeah, it's like we've totally thrown in the towel on changing the men that are doing the violence.
Yep.
We're like, well, they can't be bothered to alter their lives in any way whatsoever, so let's totally refashion the train system to accommodate the fact that they can't get better. It's like it's such a low expectation of what men in general are capable of. Alyssa, I would love to hear from you about what about men who compare women's fear of being assaulted or, you know, raped, but, you know, on their walk home from work, like, or from a friend's house, like Sarah Everard. What do you think about men who compare that to their fears of being robbed or mugged?
God. So, well, one, just to go back to Grace's point for a second, it shows the inherent laziness, right? To say that we're going to give you a special train to ride on, right? Instead of saying we're going to increase the penalties against people who commit these crimes. And also, not for nothing, but fucking psychopaths that want to commit crimes against women, putting them all in the same car is not the fucking way to go. Like, that's like, and I don't even mean to be funny, like, logistically, that's a fucking terrible idea.
Target on our backs. Yes, exactly.
It's terrible. And so, you know,
that's a
now,
conference.
wait, Erin.
That's a creep conference. We're putting them together in a convention situation.
Yes. And so, you know, what I say to men who are like, you don't know what it's like to worry about being robbed. Okay. When you were 16 and grew up in upstate New York, okay, upstate New York at this time, when cows probably outnumbered kids in my high school, and I was taught, you always carry your key between your fingers when you go to your car. You always check the back seat of your car before you get in it. Like, okay, we've lived with that our whole lives. I have a beeper thing in my bag. You pull the pin out, it flashes, it makes noise, you know, to try to ward people away. I don't know one man that has that in his car or thinks to himself before he leaves to go down to the city, do I have my bird beeper? Just because you never know. So these men, they just don't know. Because guess what? Chances are, if you're really just being straight up robbed and you give them your money, they're going to leave you the fuck alone. Okay, that's not what happens when a woman gets assaulted, because she's about to be fucking raped. So I think that those guys need to just continue their membership in the Not All Men Club, and you know, leave the opining on safety concerns to people who actually have them.
Tien, if you're comfortable sharing, do you remember the first, because Alyssa said that, like, for our whole lives we're walking with our keys, you know, between our fingers, and everybody was nodding here. And I've tried to think about this for myself. Like, do you remember the first time that you felt like compelled to either fear sexual violence or speak out against it, and what happened?
I can think about like the fear of it. I come from a family of all sisters. I have 3 sisters, and my mom and I and my oldest sister used to go to New York a lot together because my sister was in Ghost Rider.
Word.
And I just remember like anytime we got into a car, like would always look in the back, like without question, would always look in the back. And the other thing I remember is being like, it has happened a lot of times, but like being at a bar and some man trying to pass through and like touching the back of my, like the bottom of my back. And I spoke up and I was like, don't do that. And he took offense to that. And it's little moments like that that allow for things to trickle to larger, like the level of entitlement that men move through space, feeling like they can put their hands in places on women in a certain way. Like that's a small thing, but it made me feel violated. And I spoke up and he took offense to that and thought I was like, tried to make me feel like I was not, like I was in the wrong. That it was
You're the wrong for not liking the thing that he did.
Yes.
Like it's his, he can do whatever he wants, and your responsibility is to like it.
To like it.
One of the last things that I did in a public space right before the pandemic was at a mall, and I almost got into a fight with a dude. This is real. Like, angry grace never comes out. But I was trying to pay for something at some department store. And my husband was trying on like shoes in a different area, and I was trying to pay for something. And this guy rolls up and he's got like a group of women around him, and he just steps in my space. Like he can tell that I'm checking out, but I'm not done yet. And he just, you know, he gets so close to me that his elbow is like in my ribs, and he's laughing and he's gesticulating and he's making his presence very well known. He's taking up a lot of space. And like you, Tien, I said something. I was like, I'm not done here or something. And it was a little, you know, curt, but it wasn't like, fuck you. It was just like, I'm not done yet. And he was like, oh, really? Wow. You want to start a fight? I mean, he got into my face about it. And it took everything I had, and I didn't hold back. I was like, no, sir, I'm just trying to stay in my space here to finish my transaction or whatever. And it was a perfect example of exactly what you're talking about, that men move through space expecting us to move out of the way for them, which is emblematic of the conversation that we're having. Men move through life expecting to take up the space that they're going to, make the decisions that they are going to, and we as women are expected to mold to that. And when that is challenged, violence occurs, which is why I believe that we are seeing these greater threads of violence all over the world.
Do you think that it's more violence, or do you think that it's women being like, no, dude, like? Because if you look at like what women face throughout history, I feel like the difference now is not the level of violence. It's women being like, no.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. That and that's what men are uncomfortable with, that they are not historically accustomed to women actually speaking up against it. But you're right that the violence has occurred throughout history. It is not new. It is not new by any means.
It's, I am on a lot of sports Instagrams, and the comment section is truly wild place for sexism. But anytime there's like female athletes or any sort of mention of equality, there is always someone who's like, okay, well, if it's going to be equality, well, then can I punch a woman? And it's like, can the equality be that nobody gets punched? Like the thought that like immediately equality to that person was like, okay, well then can I fight them? Can I like, can I go box a woman? And it's like, no, I think it's okay if nobody gets punched. Like, I think a blanket of no violence is the equality that we're trying to get to.
Right.
Because I think in some ways men have falsely equivocated masculinity with violence, as though to be a man inherently means to be violent. And that when we challenge violence, we are challenging masculinity. But those things are not one and the same. You can be a man and not be violent.
I totally agree. And I think it's like, Alyssa, I was, you and I have kind of like texted a little bit about like protest movements stateside, like here in the US. when it comes to like women standing up against gender inequality, like the Women's March, that was one of the biggest demonstrations globally in history when it happened in 2017. But before that, there were slut walks, and then there was like Take Back the Night.
Yeah.
Do you feel frustrated that this issue is coming up not only in the US, but globally over and over again? And do you see that as like us repeating our mistakes? And what needs to change, do you think, in order for something to be considered like a success?
Here's what I think. I think that it is all successful, right? Mm-hmm. It's all successful because the truth is that before, people were suffering in silence. Before, one of the most interesting things about the Women's March back in January of 17 wasn't that there were massive crowds in New York and LA. It's that thousands of cities participated, and it's that actual percentages of populations in places like Alaska participated. And so I think that sometimes it's looked at as these problems are like elitist. It's just white ladies. They want to wear their merch and they want to go out and march. And I think that what these protests all do is really kind of bring everybody's stories out. There's not one kind of issue that Donald Trump sort of galvanized people around the Women's March. But there were so many different experiences that people had in their own lives that got them out to march and to see all these other women and to meet all these other people and families who had either similar problems or different problems, and to realize that like it takes everybody to be loud about these issues and say, yeah, you think you pass some laws, you think that we all wear matching shirts and that everything's fixed and fine, and it's not. Mm-hmm. And the truth is, though, I think that by continuing to march, I think that, and I'm not being America-centric here, but I think that the movement of the Women's March galvanized all sorts of communities across the world that started talking about the problems in their communities, which may have been very different than the ones that started the marches here in America. And so I think that getting people together so that they know that they're not alone, they're forming support systems, they strengthen their communities when they do these sort of demonstrations of solidarity by getting together and marching. And they also just continue to remind people it's not over. It's not fixed. Just because Donald Trump's not president anymore doesn't mean it's fixed in America.
Just because Argentina has legalized abortion doesn't mean that it's easy to be accessed, doesn't mean that women have information about how to get it done safely and properly. You're absolutely right, too, that even when laws are passed, it doesn't mean necessarily that they are implemented. There's a big difference between passing of a law and the implementation of a law that can take generations to fix.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look at what happened in Chile. Chile is an example of like a super dramatic cause and seeming effect. Like the 1 million women marching in Santiago in 2020. At the end of last year, they got a whole ass new constitution, like that mandates gender parity in the government representation. Like they rewrote their constitution. And I think it was a long time coming because their old constitution was like a relic from the Pinochet era. And I think they probably wanted to move on beyond that. But, it works. And I think that it's not just like a legal change. I think it's also a cultural change, and you can't really legislate culture. So Tien, I want to end with you because we have to move on to the next segment of the show. But look, I hate that I feel the need to even say this. Like, we all know and like some men. We're all fine with some men that we know. Some of my favorite dads are men. But it does seem like the common thread here is men. Like, do you think that giant women's movements are changing men's minds? And how should men go about, like the good men, how should the good men go about changing the culture that the bad men are displaying?
I do think it's changing the culture for men. And I think for, quote, good men is to speak up and say something, and to, advocate for women who aren't related to you, just like advocate for women across the board. If you don't know them, when you see something that happens, that you speak up. Like, for example, I hate to bring him up, but that the reporter from Good Morning Britain that spoke up against Piers Morgan, it was that. If a woman had, I really believe that if a woman had tried to confront him, that he would have pushed back, not listened, interrupted. And it takes, and I think it does. It takes, like, you know, when you're in if you're hanging out with all your boys, picking fantasy football drafts, and someone says something sexist or homophobic, say something. Because I think those, like you said, culturally, it's both legislative, but also culturally. Like, if we allow for these jokes that are sexist, homophobic, and racist to continue to get just a pass, it dehumanizes people in a way that then trickles into rhetoric that then turns into legislation that is violent. And then also that, like, seeps into people's brains in a way that leads to white supremacist violence. So, you know, and I say white supremacist because I think that is all entangled with, like, how violence against women as well. And so, good men out there, just speak up. We need you. We need you to help us push back against this bullshit.
Yeah, like, use your power if you have it and you're not using it. What's the point of even having it? If you're one of those guys that's like, you know, I've got privilege. I love women. I'm a feminist. Like, okay, yeah, use that and be uncomfortable sometimes. Like, it's literally, we're uncomfortable a lot of the time. So maybe, like,
I'm uncomfortable right now.
I know. I'm like, I'm totally uncomfortable.
No, it's like we get our periods once a month. They should also pick 1 week of the month where they're very uncomfortable and they stand up against everything.
By the way, that's what
they
that's
too
what
can have
I
a
meant.
period.
That's what I meant when I said I'm uncomfortable right now.
oh, congrats, Grace. Yeah, do it. Take a week every month, men, and just be like, I'm going to be a pain in the ass to every man that is a sexist or a homophobe or a racist. I will buy you Advil. I will bring you ice cream if you do that. I think it's only fair.